This event run by the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, or ISDG, at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we are grateful for the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities and the Cambridge Heritage Research Center for their support of this group and making this event possible. The ISDG is a graduate student-led initiative started in 2019 with the objective of 1, promoting scholarship by and about Indigenous peoples across disciplines, spaces, and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge, and 2, promoting the sharing and discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. I'm Leanne Daly, a second-year PhD student here at the Department of Archaeology at Cambridge, and my PhD focuses on how Indigenous communities are using repatriation to challenge extinction discourse. And my PhD focuses on the main case study of the remains of Chief Nono Sabasut and his wife Damasduit that were repatriated from National Museum Scotland back to Newfoundland, Canada. And Chief Nono Sabasut and Damasduit are believed to be 2 of the last Beothuk people. So the idea of sort of investigating and challenging the idea of Indigenous peoples categorized as extinct is obviously very relevant to this evening's event, engaging with myths of Indigenous extinctions through museum collections. So to speak about how museums containing some of the most important anthropological collections in the UK and the world have been tackling the idea of Indigenous extinctions over time, we are honored to have with us this evening the directors of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge and the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford, Professor Nicholas Thomas and Professor Laura van Broekhoven. So firstly, Professor Laura van Broekhoven is the director of the Pitt Rivers and professor of museum studies, ethics, and material culture at the University of Oxford. A fellow of Linacre College, Laura is also associated with the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography. Previously, Laura led the curatorial department of the National Museum of World Cultures, Amsterdam, Leiden, and Bergendal, and was a lecturer in archaeology, museum studies, and Indigenous heritage at the Faculty of Archaeology at Leiden University. Laura's current research interests include repatriation and redress, with a focus on the importance of collaboration, inclusivity, and reflexive inquiry. Her regional academic research has focused on collaborative collection research with Amazonian, Suriname, and Brazil Indigenous peoples, Yucatan Maya oral history, and Mixtec Indigenous market systems, as well as Nicaraguan Indigenous resistance in colonial times. She has curated numerous exhibitions and authored dozens of books, articles, and papers. Professor Nicholas Thomas is director of the MAA and fellow of Trinity College here at Cambridge. He's the author and editor of nearly 50 influential books and exhibition catalogs, which have ranged widely over art in Oceania, European travel, colonial histories, museology, and the history of collections. His books have included Entangled Objects, which influentially contributed to the revival of material culture studies, Possessions, Indigenous Art and Colonial Culture, a comparative post-colonial art history of Australia and New Zealand, and Islanders, the Pacific in the Age of Empire, which was awarded the Wolfson History Prize. Oceania, which Nick co-curated with Peter Brunt for the Royal Academy of Arts in London and the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris in 2018-2019, was acclaimed as a landmark exhibition by critics across major newspapers in the UK, France, Germany, the States, as well as in Pacific nations themselves. Nick has curated and co-curated many other exhibitions at the MAA and elsewhere, often in collaboration with contemporary artists. So we welcome both of them this evening. Laura and Nick will each give a presentation regarding how their museums have engaged with the myths of Indigenous extinctions, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A from the audience. So before we do begin, there are just the regular housekeeping points that I'll mention here. So please do keep your microphone turned off. The event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind as if you keep your cameras on or off if you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you consent to being recorded, and the recording will be available on the CRASSH website and the ISDG Cambridge YouTube channel soon after the event. During the Q&A, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat or to me as ISDG Cambridge, and then we can read your question out loud. Or if you want to ask the question yourself, you can just let us know in the chat and then we'll unmute you. So captioning has been enabled for the event, and if you'd like to have captioning, you can select that at the bottom of your screen. But please note that the captions are provided by Zoom, and CRASSH is not held responsible for the accuracy of those at this time, but rest assured that you can revisit the event recording later on YouTube. And we're doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event, so it goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and to each other throughout the event. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Nick for his presentation.
Just to say thanks very much for the invitation. This group is central to my interests and work commitments over many years. So it's great to be involved in a conversation with you. And I wanted to start by saying that when Leanne asked me about this particular topic, I wasn't quite sure what I should, what angle I should try to bring, but it was something that resonated for me for a number of reasons, but not least because I'm going to go on to showing slides, but because when I was a second year undergraduate in Australia, at the Australian National University in 1978, there was a big controversy that year that consumed people's attention the way I'm sure Benin and related issues have been talked about by students over the last couple of years. So a film was around the cinemas. It had a lot of publicity. It was called The Last Tasmanian. It featured a prominent archaeologist, Rhys Jones, and it was basically a kind of narrative of Tasmanian archaeology, but also Tasmanian history. And it foregrounded this story about, as it says in the blurb, the film's still available from distributors in Australia. It was about the removal of a whole society and culture from the face of the earth. And the title, referring to Trukanini, was pretty unambiguous about a claim about extinction. That website does include an admission that the film was intensively debated. Many Tasmanians considered the title and the overall narrative offensive. And the reason I thought that this was a sort of helpful point to start was because in this space, I think one's conscious that every narrative has sort of both an upside and a downside. And the striking aspect of this debate was that I think the reaction caught the filmmakers and the archaeologists involved in the project by surprise, which may seem extraordinary in hindsight. But I think there was a sense that producing a big documentary telling the story of the colonial impact, dispossession, and genocide, that was somehow part of a progressive kind of narrative that was drawing attention to a history of massacre and violence that had been perpetrated on Indigenous Australian people, and it being sort of written up in these rather categorical terms, such that Truganini was identified as the last Tasmanian. That was seen as part of the rhetorical power of that aspect of Australia's hidden history that needed to be exposed, revealed, told. And the sense that there was a downside here, that that narrative obviated, denied the existence of the Indigenous people who were still alive in Tasmania, was kind of missed. And I guess for me, this is a significant, can be a significant dilemma in public space. You frame the narrative for a book or an exhibition or an intervention. It kind of always has both an upside and a downside. So in response to this kind of debate, many curators, producers of media in this space move towards emphasizing continuity and survival in the field of Indigenous culture. That is, and the effective, I guess, presentation of that kind of narrative is something that we have been working with since. and the challenges of offering narratives of continuity and survival that at the same time do not suggest that genocide and other very horrific impacts that reduced populations very considerably did not take place. So I wanted just to talk briefly about how these issues were negotiated in a big project that MAA and I personally was involved in. There's much more I could say about the way we aim to represent living presences, the living presences of Indigenous peoples in the galleries and displays at MAA. That is kind of a longer story, and in a way I'd hope that we could do that sometimes by walking around the museum and seeing what responses you have to elements of the displays there. This example makes me, enables me to make a sort of more focused kind of point. We were fortunate to get involved in this project partly because it had a lot more resource invested in it than most of the projects that a university museum can be engaged in. We were fortunate to be able to do sustained research, in part with Indigenous people, around collections. Many visitors from the Pacific helped us shape the selection of objects, but also the narrative. As the show took place, as the show evolved, I think our sense of the importance of contemporary work became sort of progressively stronger, so that people entered it. There was this map that helped them understand the space of the Pacific, but this huge blue tarpaulin piece, which was the work of a collective of Maori women, a textile piece about the ocean, but also the ocean as expression of genealogy, essentially, that enabled us to get beyond the idea that the Pacific was a geographic feature or a space of physical geography. Our story was absolutely about it being an inhabited realm that was constituted through people's travels and naming. We included performance right at the start of the exhibition in order to connect questions of cultural history with questions that had particular sort of political urgency. And there were themes about voyaging, there were themes about architecture and placemaking, gods and ancestors, gifts and transactions and appropriations, performance, colonial change and appropriation, the cultural stimulus of early encounters for contemporary artists, in this case, Lisa Rehana, questions of memory, and so on. But so, I mean, clearly this was an exhibition that wanted to demonstrate that the cultures of the Pacific were powerfully alive, dynamic, fertile right now in the present, producing new works that were just as consequential as cultural expressions as anything that had been produced historically. So that was about presence, but I think the presence was not the most important part of it. At an early stage in consultations and discussions, one of our colleagues, somebody in a seminar in New Zealand, said, you know, you really got to get warm bodies into this exhibition, so that whatever we did conceptually in terms of narrative and so on would not have made sense or not have been sufficient unless the space was, in a sense, occupied by islanders and brought to life with their performance. So, one of the contemporary works was by a very accomplished Maori artist Michael Parakafe. It's a grand piano that was sculpted like a Maori object. It recalls a whole set of narratives, including those of the film, The Piano, about the transposition of, in a sense, sort of high European culture to the South Pacific. But it was also a participatory work in the sense that people who came to the exhibition could fill in a sign-up sheet and play the piano. So it was meant to be animated. And then there were a lot of things that happened around this exhibition that were not planned, but did just happen. So that there were Rapa Nui visitors who were coming in fact to form a delegation to the British Museum to talk about the Ahu Moai, and they understood that there was also a piece in our exhibition. So more or less without any notice, they came to the exhibition to visit that ancestor. Under other circumstances, if this had been pre-planned, we would have brought them in at a time when the show was closed to the public so that they could have a private engagement. But there wasn't time or notice for that. So they simply sort of wandered in when the gallery was full of ordinary visitors who were totally spellbound by this engagement. And in fact, fortuitously, they didn't have another commitment right afterwards, and spent most of the rest of the afternoon just sort of talking to members of the public and so on. A number of visitors also left offerings. And so the two stones at the front are volcanic stones from the same quarry as or probably the same quarry as the piece itself is from. This was done at a number of points, and there was a curatorial decision to leave these offerings for the duration of the exhibition. We made a curatorial decision not to include work that was looted, with one particular exception, that big sort of overlit food trough from the Solomon Islands, in order, in a sense, to tell that particular story. And that Solomon Islands flag is placed there in relation to that history. All of this was left in place until the end of the program. And I think this was what really made this quite a special sort of experience for a lot of people. It couldn't be planned. A lot of it happened fortuitously. But the point, I think the key point is that it's actually not in the end about the narrative you tell, about what curators decide that they should do. It's about the extent that you can enable other people to enter the space and claim the space and make their own interventions in the space. So that's basically, there was a wider, all sorts of things that went on in this context that I could say more about, but I think my point is basically that you don't necessarily get it right by having a perfect narrative. The challenge is to empower engagement and make that engagement accessible and meaningful to your wider publics and constituencies. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Nick. It was really great to hear a bit more about Oceania. And even though, it's been a couple of years since that exhibition happened, that, people are still in dialogue about it and still looking at it, because it was such a great exhibition. And I was fortunate to see it when it was there and when it had all the offerings that were still left there as well. And it was sort of something I'd never really seen like that before in a London exhibition. So it's wonderful to see it again in pictures here. Now I'll hand it off to Laura for her presentation.
Thank you, and that was great. And I just sort of put in an extra slide because Nick's starting with sort of some of the experiences from the 70s was not reminding me of something that was happening in the 70s, but something that was happening much sooner. And actually one of the reasons that I changed or was convinced that I shouldn't continue to stay much longer in a place where I was working, which was in the Netherlands at the time. And I think I sort of had a similar reaction to what Nick was saying with the title that you gave, where the engaging with myths of Indigenous extinctions through museum collections. But then obviously, you know, a big chunk of, and I'm just going to give a couple of thoughts and case studies from the Pitt Rivers Museum. So do take it as such. It's mostly sharing some thoughts and some work that we're doing currently, but also going back to sort of early 20th century. What was the thing that the Pitt Rivers Museum said about these extinctions, Indigenous extinctions, and why sort of it almost is part of the museum's objectives, as it was, or sort of mission, you could say, at that time. But just to sort of, the slide that I added was one exhibition that we did in the Netherlands when I was still there as the head of the curatorial team at the Rijksmuseum Volkenkunde, which was part of the National Museums of World Cultures. That was an exhibition that came about of the book by Jimmy Nelson, the Before They Pass Away book, which I suppose some of you will know, which very much sort of hangs on to that idea that Indigenous people are almost going to die out. And so this exhibition was sort of the nightmare exhibition, I suppose, for many of us as curators, and very much was a huge fight, you could say, between our marketing division, who wanted to put this exhibition on, who had come up with the idea, had put the relationships in place with Jimmy Nelson, and the curatorial team, who in the end were sort of had to do the exhibition, but were very much doing a lot of damage control in trying to sort of counter these very powerful images of people who have been asked to dress up in certain gear, and then were being portrayed as if these were the last pictures we could take of them before they passed away, which was very much exactly the opposite of what our curatorial teams were working on, and we also as a museum were working on. We had a big project at the time called #Decolonize the Museum with Simone Zeefuik and Tirsa Balk and Hoda Marsame, and also with the WAG, where lots of activists and women, mostly women of color, feminist thinkers, were actually challenging the museum within the context of decolonize this space, which was also happening in the US and many other places, and sort of asking us to stop reproducing these colonial basis hierarchies, and that we were erasing the agency and perspectives of non-Western colonized people, that we were speaking from the white gaze, privileging the perspectives and stories of white colonizers. And this was both at Volkenkunde and the Tropenmuseum and Bergendal. And sort of a lot of sort of critique was coming in. We invited that critique and we were very much part of sort of that thinking process. And at the same time, we were curating exhibitions, which were sort of completely playing into the stereotype and hoping that we would sell lots of tickets. So I think that is sort of where, as museums, it was certainly very much opposite to the sort of things that we were also doing, which was much more about thinking around contemporary Caribbean perspectives, or working with George Nuku in our research center for material culture and in the curatorial sort of spaces also. So I think that is sort of where, certainly at the time that I was working at the National Museum of World Cultures, but also some of the I suppose, programming that was happening in lots of ethnographic museums up until today, still sort of at times plays with that idea of the of extinctions and the whiteness being very central, and whiteness also often being the savior, which very much sort of is at the root of some of the colonial collecting that was happening in our museums, and that leads to our collections. The collections being in the museum. So I think that's just a sort of as a bit that was sort of sparked by Nick's comments also of some of the sort of very fierce comments that came in when the Tasmanian exhibition that he was referencing, also people were really actually sort of upset about that. And I think that happened also with the Jimmy Nelson. For some, for others, there is that idea of nostalgia and of Indigenous people needing to be either protected by us or admired by us because they are closer to nature, and all those kind of stereotypical thoughts that continue to play a really important role. And as Nick was also saying, very much in our museums, one of the things we would like to do is to be a part of ensuring that there is a big counterbalance to that kind of thinking, which and to be there for those who can pass on the mic and make sure that Indigenous people actually are, when we need to give access to Indigenous people, we give access to Indigenous people, when we can program, when we can ensure that there's lots of stories that can be told in our museums. This is a pamphlet on the slide here that was at the sort of front door of the museum when people were coming into the Pitt Rivers Museum. This is what people would read. And so
sorry, Laura, we can't see the slide with the pamphlet. We just see the title side.
Okay, I don't know why that's the case.
If you put it into slideshow mode, hopefully it should allow us to see the full slide.
It is, I am actually, so what have you been seeing so far?
That was the title card that we were seeing.
You've only been seeing the title?
Yes.
You've not seen these images?
No.
So then I don't know why this is not working. I can just...
We can see it now. We can see the change in slides now.
Okay. Well, this was the Jimmy Nelson book, The Before They Pass Away. These were Simona, Zefa, Tirsa, and Hodan, and some of the slides, some of the images of sort of the decolonized place in Boston and other places. This was some of the images that I had with regards to, so it's a good thing that you were saying that you weren't able to see the slides. So with regards to the, I can't really show you the slides as they're made because apparently it's not working but so this is the, on the left-hand side, this is the sort of text that was at the front door of the Pitt Rivers Museum. And I've sort of just put it up with a little bit more so that people can read it. So one of the things that it says is that the objective of the Pitt Rivers Museum was to explain the conservatism of savage and barbarous races and the pertinacity with which they retain their ancient types of art, to exhibit survivals or the vestiges of ancient forms which have been retained through natural selection in the more advanced stages of the arts and reversions to ancient types, to illustrate the arts of the prehistoric times as far as practical by those existing savages in corresponding stages of civilization, and to aid in the solution of the problem whether man has arisen from a condition resembling the brutes or fallen from a high state of perfection. So that already sort of shows the sort of objectives at the time. We know that this pamphlet was sort of around 1905 or so, that was sort of pasted next to the doors. People knew what the museum was all about and what it was trying to do. Clearly, those are no longer the objectives of our strategic plans that we currently we're just in between changing strategic plans, where the 2017-2022 was very much about understanding our past, imagining our futures. A lot of it was actually about how do we ensure that there's more people that we're bringing into the museum to showcase that there's many ways of being, many ways of knowing, so many ontologies, many epistemologies, and many ways of coping, of sort of humanity, and how do we work towards a praxis that is very much around decoloniality, pluriversality, reconciliation, a practice that is also based on self-representation and co-curation, and about humanizing, activating, and mobilizing. And a very big component of that, as we can see here, is the work that we do, which we sort of call under the denominator of radical hope or origins and futures work, working with Maasai, San, Haida, Ainu, Tibetan communities, Shuar communities, Evenki, Nepalese, Luo, Naga communities. There's a whole range of communities that we work with, and very much where we are sort of really at the working collaboratively, sometimes we're very much sort of us reaching out to communities, seeing what kind of work we could do together. Other times it's the community reaching out to us. And I'll just give a couple of examples of that kind of work. And I must say that the work that for me has been the most motivating in the museum is where we're working with some of our either Indigenous experts, and these are some of the projects I'm being personally involved with, and it's just a few of the people that are doing work, but I obviously can't. There's not enough time to be sort of showing all the various aspects of that work, but people like Dolly Kikon and Arkotong Longpumer, with whom we're working on Naga remains. They're both Naga researchers. Dolly is in Melbourne, Arkotong is in Edinburgh. They're both researchers, Naga researchers. Samuel Angiria, who's a Maasai human rights activist that we're working with on a Maasai project. Marenga, obviously, who's working with us in the Pitt Rivers Museum, who works with a lot of Indigenous communities and really sort of within an art fund funded project is trying to look at what are other ways that we could collect materials, what are other ways that we could collect, that we could sort of rethink interpreting objects and in our displays that would be less violent and less sort of extractive and sort of mostly trying to just sort of enrich our collections instead of looking at how can so it's finding new ways of doing that kind of work. Nana Foriata Ayim, who is doing her PhD but also doing a project and has been really rethinking what museums in Ghana in particular, but I guess that applies sort of to a wider region. How might museums actually become much more, take the starting point of Indigenous museology? So that's what she's been really working on. And Thupten Kelsang, who's been working with the Tibetan community, also rethinking how museums, and especially for communities that are so dispersed and living without the sort of without the obviousness almost of having this right to being connected to the land. How can museums be, and the collections that museums have, how can they be of value to the Tibetan community? So he's been organizing a whole range of meetings with different Tibetan constituents, both internationally, those living in Tibet and those living across different parts of the world, to sort of identify what are the ways that museums could be useful, that they could engage in ways that the Tibetan community might benefit from. Just a couple of slides to just show some of that work. So Marenga has been working with Solomon Enos, who was commissioned to do some work with a art intervention in the museum. So this is an art funded project, and sort of inspired in objects in the museum. Solomon has been making these amazing artworks that are going to be put on display, and will be you can actually see them next Friday if you happen to be in the neighborhood, because we'll be sort of having a display of the works. And what he really sort of has, what's important to Sol is that he wants to sort of have an informed aspirational vision of the world at its best, through contemporary and traditional art. So bringing in sci-fi and fantasy, but at the same time, sort of really looking at sort of creation stories of Hawaii, and each figure sort of depicts a hybrid human and endemic Hawaiian insect dressed in native garb, and bearing examples of designs and artifacts that are on display in the Pitt Rivers Museum. So he's really sort of, and I think that is what is important with this kind of work, that he is reinterpreting, reinventing, and reimagining what the world looks like, and bringing those stories. All of them have been on Instagram. There's a whole community in Hawaii that have been commenting on them also. And I think it's sort of bringing to life those kind of objects in a completely different way, and sort of he sort of uses them to spark the imagination. Sol is an incredibly gifted artist, and his work will be on display now, but also will form part of the collections. While the collecting was happening, Marenka was also working with the artists to sort of, on the one hand, with a whole bunch of interns to look at our collections development policies and how colonial they were and how problematic for some of the Indigenous people that wanted to work with us or not with us because of the collection development policies. And at the same time looking at, okay, our acquisition forms, for example, and the contracts that we use, how could we start decolonizing those contracts? How can they become less sort of these power imbalance, being less, not continuing to be the only way that we can work. So it's really looking at what are other possible ways of starting to build relationships that are more equitable, more sustainable. So I think that's what we try to do, that when we're doing this work, can we also look at the way that we document? Can we look at the way that we have our contracts? Can we look at the way that we commission pieces? So it's really sort of looking at together collaboratively unpicking the ways that we do the usual museum work. And then obviously that needs to be translated into new acquisition forms, new policies, new collection development policies also. And we need to do our work with the Arts Council to make sure that they understand why we're changing our policies. And I think many of you will have sort of followed a little bit the discussions at ICOM also, the International Council of Museums, where they wanted to change the definition of museum. And I think that's the sort of discussions and debates that have come up from there, and the real fierce debates and fierce opposition against the new ICOM definition that was going to be much more about this kind of work has been really interesting to see, but also really problematic. And one might question whether some of that has to do with our continued thinking around extinction, and that what museums need to do is to preserve, because things will no longer be if we do not preserve them the ways that our white Western world feels that preservation should happen. Anyways, I'm packing a lot in, and jumping a bit up and down, but I think they're all sort of related concepts, and it would be interesting to know what the students think about this. Another project that we're working with the CHRC community. So we took off display the human remains, and in particular, a lot of reactions came from the taking off display of the shrunken heads of the Tsansa. We're working in collaboration with CHRC community members to sort of identify what could care look like. Does it need to involve repatriation? Does it need to involve other ways of caring, other ways of putting on display? So that's the kind of questions that we're discussing there. A lot of the problematics actually with the CHRC being able to move forward with that collaboration has to do with extractivism. And I think that is a topic that, and I'll touch on in a little bit, is that extinction and so Indigenous extinction, I sort of the extinction of Indigenous people, is not a new topic on the one hand, and is one that sort of has, I suppose, when it was discussed in the framework with it, that I just showed, that used to be sort of at the front door of the Pitt Rivers Museum. It was very much a framework of this sort of white saviorism and we need to save Indigenous people. But if you, for the CHRC, for example, the real issues that they are facing at the moment, apart from not having access to some of their cultural heritage, has much more to do with concessions that are being given to mining companies who are doing extractive mining in their territories. Those mining companies, many of them are either Chinese, they could be Swiss, they could be Canadian, are then setting up museums, little museums that sort of have CHRC, and some of the CHRC agree to concessions being given to their territories, but many actually do not agree to that. That causes a lot of divisions among the CHRC, and that actually affects also the possibilities for museums to do any kind of work on the collections, because the CHRC, on the one hand, do want to do that kind of work, but at the same time, there's a whole range of other aspects that actually influence whether they can sort of work together on topics such as trying to understand better what the objects in these collections are. And then so some of these projects have been about redesigning what is it that we need to do around care around these objects, like the CHRC object, the CHRC work with Indigenous people, CHRC Indigenous people, the work that Marinka has been doing with the Hawaiian community has been very much around rethinking how can we do acquisitions and what kind of objects should be in our displays. And other work that we've been doing, like the work with the Naga, the work with the Maasai, but also the work with the Evenki, has been about reconciliation and has been around, that's sort of what came out of the conversations. The Maasai Living Cultures Project is a project that started in 2017, where we work with Maasai delegates who've come to, and the Cambridge also has joined, and you can see Mark Elliott here actually in the picture, who's one of the curators from the MAA in Cambridge. Started with Samuel Langiria coming to the Pitt Rivers Museum, identifying a number of objects that we had brought out for them to see. He was in Oxford for an Indigenous leadership program, and he indicated, I do not understand how these objects, how they ended up here, why were they ever collected? These were objects that you should have never been given away, because these are objects of inheritance, they're objects that are ritual objects. So that led to several delegations, us inviting several delegations to come and work with us and really sort of first identify which objects were problematic, both in the Cambridge collections and in the Leiden collections, in the Oxford collections. And then second delegation indicating who brought a spiritual sort of seer, the Laibon, with an Enkidong, which is a sacred calabash, to read what the history was of those objects. And the next stage will be that we need to do reconciliation ceremonies in Kenya around those objects. The same happened with the Evenki, actually, where we have a display in the Pitt Rivers Museum, and Anya Gleiser and Galinha, who's an artist, this is Galinha, who's an artist in Evenki territory, so that this is in Russia, so it's Siberia. I indicated that they found lots of aspects of some of the objects that we had on display quite problematic, both in the way that they were put on display, but also the way that they were taken. This was a sacred drum, amongst other things, but also objects that were taken from graves. And they indicated that they felt, and that's what the Evenki communities have sort of said, that on the one hand, we needed to change the display, and on the other hand, there needed to be a sort of performance ceremony done in the museum to undo the harm that is still continuing to affect the Evenki communities. So this is something that we've been practicing now with lots of our staff. Obviously, this is all being live streamed instead of that the Evenki can come to the Pitt Rivers Museum at the moment because of the global situation with the war in Ukraine. But the work to be part of a process of undoing and redressing the colonial harm is sort of at the heart of why we're doing all of this, these kind of projects. So at the moment, we're very much sort of in our draft thinking of the conceptual frameworks within which we work. And I think that is where we very much are sort of engaging with, but in a different way, with the ideas of extinction and the ideas of sort of the Anthropocene and moments of crisis that we're living, very much also from trying to take Indigenous concepts to guide us around, for example, pluriversality, but also interconnectivity, engaging with extractivism as an aspect of our work. And just to sort of close off, I guess, sort of Kyle White's Indigenous Climate Change Studies, Indigenizing Futures, a quote from there where it said, as Indigenous peoples, we do not tell our futures beginning from the position of concern with the Anthropocene as a hitherto unanticipated vision of human intervention, which involves mass extinctions and the disappearance of certain ecosystems for the colonial period already rendered comparable outcomes that cost Indigenous peoples their reciprocal relationships with thousands of plants, animals, and ecosystems, which most of which are not coming back. So that how this extinction, so not the Indigenous extinction, but actually the effect of our processes of extractivism is much more where I would want to put a focus, and maybe also some of the unlocking of the work that we can do of stories that lie within our collections together with Indigenous people. And so not starting from this is just something that is started now, but it has much deeper roots and has affected Indigenous people for so much longer. And there's no white saviorism in that picture. That sort of, but there are, I suppose, roles of sort of care and roles of listening and learning and being supportive that museums can play, hopefully, today.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. It's really great to hear about sort of all the different programs that are going on at the Pitt Rivers and even the connection that it has to Cambridge within those programs as well. And I'm sure we'll all continue to watch how those programs unfold. So just, does anyone have any questions to start us off that they want to put in the chat or raise their hand? If there's no questions right off the bat, I can sort of kickstart us here. And if you think of questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat or just let us know that you want us to unmute you. So one of the things that was really interesting in both presentations was talking about the idea of like contemporary works being not necessarily just brought in sort of like organized programs, but also, Nick, like you were talking about, people just bringing offerings or delegations that just sort of showed up to visit the exhibition and to visit ancestors there in the exhibition. So that's sort of bringing these contemporary objects and contemporary people, contemporary activities into the museum. But something else that's obviously talked about a lot is sort of taking things out of the museum in terms of repatriation or sort of ongoing relationships like loans and things like that with objects. So I was just wondering if both of you could speak about the role of that in terms of not just extinction necessarily, but in terms of contemporary communities engaging with that process of repatriation.
Well, I could just sort of chip in briefly, and I think that is a helpful point where there is a shift of practice, and I think what we're thinking about increasingly is not just sort of lending things to go into exhibitions where they travel and they appear in a display case and then they are packed up and they they come back. A lot of museums have lent material to countries of origin and to local museums and Indigenous museums. I think what's kind of exciting and really interesting and rewarding is lending for study purposes, and also enabling material to be handled. I mean, for a long time, there's been a sort of anomaly in the sense that if we had, you know, a few representatives from an Indigenous group and they came to the Pitt Rivers or Cambridge or to the British Museum or the Cape Bromley or somewhere else, I mean, they could get into a workroom setting with heritage that they're connected to. They could handle it, they could spend as much time as they wanted with it. But if we were sending these objects to an exhibition in New Zealand or Australia, they would not have those engagement opportunities. And that has really started in a particularly rewarding way with the exhibition in Gisborne that took a lot of very early material back to New Zealand for the first time, material collected on Cook's first voyage from the specific locality. The Taonga went to the marae first, and people had the opportunity to perform with those ancestral forms in that context. And then before the exhibition started, there were a number of days for sort of small group study sessions and handling. And I guess one of the other parts of the landscape that has sort of changed is that in some of these contexts, Indigenous people have developed a huge amount of expertise in engaging with historic material culture, so that when these projects first started 30 years ago, I mean, you might have some people who were makers, clearly, who had expertise, but often people had not seen 18th or 19th century artifacts and didn't necessarily have particular questions of them. But what is really striking now is that there are many communities where people have had specialist training either locally, or they've done degrees in conservation or materials science, or they're makers of genres that may not have been remade since the early colonial period. And so there is certainly the opportunity for us to learn a huge amount from people who have much deeper knowledge that really does depend on handling and engaging the weight of things and the textures of things and the specific materials. So it's, I think importantly, it's not just a sort of, I mean, it's really important that it is a democratizing moment in the ways that the various projects Laura referred to exemplify. But it's also a moment of kind of a much more powerful cross-cultural engagement with historic artifacts than has really taken place in relation to any institution for you know, a very long time.
Yeah, and I'd say that what really, I suppose for us, this kind of work, what it really does is it sort of deeply challenges the assumptions that museums have around the work that we need to do. And I guess that's where museums really, you know, to a certain degree benefit, and at the same time Indigenous peoples also feel that they benefit, because if we could, for example, start really questioning, is preservation care the sort of care that museums should be giving, or is cultural care the sort of care that museums should be giving? Then cultural care might demand for objects to, on the one hand, be returned, as is what you're sort of referencing. It might also require ceremony to take place, or it might require payments to be made, or it might require objects to be sung to, or fed, or you know, sort of danced, so it might require musical instruments to be played again. So I think that is much more the sort of deep questioning of our assumptions, the same around how do we document collections, do all collections need to be online, etc., etc. So I think that is the sort of things that we really need to start rethinking, and then challenging our own sector sort of demands, I suppose, on especially for the kinds of collections that have come into our museums. It might be that that objects need to go back. They don't need to be in a museum context. It might be that they need to go back for short periods of time, or they need to go fully back and maybe disintegrate. And I think those kind of discussions. Also, when, for example, I need to speak to our legal services team and there is a request for repatriation, and the assumption that always will be, especially in universities, it might be different in Cambridge, but it certainly is in the case of Oxford, that an object needs to go from our museum to another museum to be put on display again and to be researched and to be sort of ready to be learned from, is such a sort of prevalent assumption that it will appear in documents when I need to then say, well, actually, I don't think that is what we want to put in this document, because it's not the kind of demand that we would need to put on objects and on objects' care anymore, from a sort of decolonized perspective, let's say.
Great, thank you for those answers. I think that's really sort of enlightening to see how those things are being talked about and looked at sort of behind the scenes. I know that we had a conversation from Alexandra, but I think the sort of tail end of your answer there, Laura, sort of started talking about collection care. We do have a question coming in from Susanna. I was very interested in the Pitt Rivers current program. I believe that the Pitt Rivers displays cannot be changed or regenerated, i.e. made alive again. So how is Laura dealing with that?
Yeah, so if the question is they cannot be changed because of heritage laws and sort of the fact that it's a Grade 1 listed building, then that only applies to, so that to a certain degree that's true. Our architecture is Grade 1 listed, and there's also the sort of atmosphere is Grade 1 is listed, but none of the 19th century displays are actually still on display. That has nothing to do with me. That's pre my time, because people sometimes get very angry when change happens in the Pitt Rivers Museum. But I think in the 1990s or so was when the last bit of original 19th century display was taken off display. So the museum has always been changing. It's just that I think some of the narratives that we've been continuing to replicate are really problematic, and it's unnecessary. So it's partly in the assemblages and the way that we've put together certain displays. So we'll have two display cases that are human form in art. And that's, one could say, okay, human form in art from lots of different places. But when you look a little bit deeper, it shows that actually there's one human form in art that is all European, and sort of the civilized human forms in art of sort of Asia and some other parts that were considered civilized, like ancient Egypt. And the other case is full of ancient art, human form in art, that is from those places that were considered savage or primitive in the sort of social evolutionist thinking. And I think that's where we sort of are really looking a little bit deeper than just assuming that things are not problematic. And there's no problem with us switching over objects in cases, or telling different narratives, or starting to also use more smart glass, for example, and start to build in QR codes and bringing in lots of new narratives, bringing in more people to tell stories in the museum. So I think that's the sort of thinking that we're starting to engage with. We can take things off display when they need to be taken off display. If communities, for example, ask us to take objects off display. So there's, I think, this idea of sort of permanence and unchanging Pitt Rivers Museum. We've curated it specifically for people to think that way when they come in, and at the same time, it's not really so that we really cannot make changes. I'm not somebody, and I think that goes for all of my team at the moment, we're not wanting to rip apart the museum and just make it into this another sanitized white cube. I think there's sufficient sanitized white cube museums and they do really good work, but that's not what the Pitt Rivers is. So I think the idea of sort of where we are thinking around pluriversality and bringing in Indigenous voices is much more around the stories that we tell, the assemblages that we curate, the objects that might need to be made still, new objects, new commissioned art. But that is really objects that people want us to put on display and want us to, from a sort of self representation, that's the way they would like to be represented.
Thanks so much, Laura. And I know that we are coming up on time here, so if we could just have sort of a brief answer to the last couple of questions from Alexandra. The first being about sort of a condition potentially of stability in terms of like conflict areas when something's returned. And then for Nick, sort of your views on curation since sort of the 2018-2019 experience with Oceania. So just sort of very brief remarks that'll be our final ones for this evening.
Maybe let Nick answer first, because I think he needs to leave soon.
Thanks. It's been a really interesting discussion. The question about returning material to unstable areas, I sort of hesitate to say anything at all, because I think those of us who have kind of got into these kind of debates, not about the principle of return, but about the concrete cases, just find that there is so much complexity, which is not a reason for not trying to do it, but just meaning that it has to be navigated in very different ways in each context. And I think what we discover more and more is that the fundamental questions, or the really challenging questions are you know, who should we be engaging with? Because there are often either sort of tensions or outright conflicts between you know, governments and cultural institutions, you know, on the one hand, that might be wanting to claim material back, and some local communities and agencies, and obviously, as museums with a sort of base in ethnography in a positive sense rather than a negative sense, we have a kind of inclination to sort of side with and want to prioritize engagement with the locals. But that in itself then becomes complex because there are often different local constituencies as well. So the question about whether it's the right time is also something that there may be quite different local views about. Just the second question, has my view about how to curate an exhibition changed? I think what I'd more say is that exhibitions are really all for the challenge, I think, in both Oxford and Cambridge and the UK is that we have complex audiences. I mean, we're working among our constituencies as the students of the universities, academics, researchers, the people who live in Cambridge or in Oxford, or people who live in London when we're working with London institutions, international publics, and also where there is an exhibition that is concerned with Maori or Edo or other people in West Africa. Obviously, even though the bulk of that population is not going to have the opportunity to see the exhibition, at least in a physical sense, we clearly want to sort of honor their perspectives in some sense, so that even if the audience is primarily a Cambridge audience, there's the question of how do we do it in a way that those people from, for example, Nigeria who get to see it feel that it is a positive and an apt representation of whatever history we're engaged with. So I think it's continually a challenge to negotiate those issues. And I guess I would just kind of come back to, in a sense, the point I was trying to make at the start, which was that we don't do it by being experts or being clever and working out the right way of doing it. We do it by doing it together and co-producing it in whatever sense. And that was another part of the effort in Oceania. I mean, my co-curator and Peter Brunt is an academic of Samoan descent, but more importantly, it wasn't us two as academics saying, this is the picture, this is the story, because all of those contemporary artists in that exhibition were concerned with questions of place, history, narrative, colonial encounter, performance, memory, and so on. So that essentially we were kind of all engaged in a project of co-interpreting these questions. And I think Laura alluded to sort of passing the mic. I mean, that absolutely has to be at the core of everything we do.
And Laura, do you have any just final remarks to add to close us out?
No, just on the returning to unstable area. So I think clearly, when there's war, which is the example that is given here, it will influence how and when objects need to be returned, but there's always a possibility to already return legal title, for example, to hand over legal title, so that actually it's really clear that the intention is to give objects back. But I do think that we need to sort of maybe also qualify what we mean by unstable house, and the assumption that where we live is stable, given the current government and the war happening in Ukraine, and also I suppose we need to think about sort of what does doing violence and doing harm mean around Indigenous collections. And I think that is where for many Indigenous peoples, at least that I've worked with, the way we care for objects and the way we put them on display and the way we talk about them is also constitutes harm. So I think that is where we just need to, be quite honest and open about, what do we mean by unstable or harmful, or so yeah, I think that's where I'm conflicted about the starting point, I suppose. But I do obviously understand, as Nick was saying completely correctly, and every case for return or case for repatriation or for redress is full of complexity, and the complexity seems to at times sort of snowball, and it becomes bigger and bigger. And I think that's what Nick and I were saying just before we opened the room, that we could probably fill a whole evening just talking about the complexities that have occurred in the last couple of days. And it's sometimes it's really difficult to make one sort of goes on a certain course, and then during the process, which often takes really long, especially with repatriation requests, so many different aspects suddenly come sort of flying in, and you constantly have to go back to say, okay, is this still the right decision? Is this still the way we need to go? Are these the right claimants? Is this the right? I think that was what Nick was also saying, that there's just a whole range of really difficult questions, and you don't want to drop the ball, and at the same time sort of continue to I don't know, do the right thing, is that the right expression? So I think that is where it's a continuation of choices and of trying to find information, trying to get advice, trying to be a listening institution, and not doing more harm on the way.
I think that's a great way to sort of finish us off for the evening here. And as you both said, these are very complex questions that will sort of continue on between all of us. And we're really appreciative that both of you and the museums are engaging with those complex questions and ideas. And so I'd just like to thank you both again so much for your engaging presentations and for taking the time to be with us today. And of course, thanks to our audience here as well. This is our last ISDG event for this academic year, but we're pleased to announce that we will be a research network with CRASSH coming into the new academic year. We just found out today. So you can feel free to follow us on our website and our socials to see the new events that we'll have going on in the new academic year in the fall. And again, to Laura and Nick, it was great to hear about the different programs that you have going on as well. And again, I'm sure that we'll all follow those projects as they come about. But for everyone, once again, thank you so much for your participation this past year and for all of our participants. And we hope to see you in the new year. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.